Hello, ladies. Welcome to Homemaking Radio. I hope you get a lot done while you listen today. And I have embedded this on another page. And if you'll go to the description box on the channel, you can click that link and it will have the video on it, plus a few other things around the manse. I'm Mrs. Sherman, and I have been married for over 50 years now and have been a preacher's wife that long. Also am a veteran homeschooler, so I like to include a little bit of homeschooling for you, and I've chosen a curriculum for you, but you can choose your own. I'm just going to share some of the things that I'd like to teach you or share with you. I hope that you'll become autodidactic and be self-taught and learn by yourself and not need a teacher. And also, I wanted to be careful to tell you not to do things just because I do them, because I might not have good results all the time and it might not result in good things for you. So you need to compare it and temper it and see if it works for you or for your family, and not just because I like it. I'm just going to give a few ideas and inspiration. Now, to begin with, we start out our day at home by getting dressed. And I don't care where you live. If you live in a yurt, if you live in a tent, if you live in a cottage somewhere, or if you live in a manse, let's give it some dignity because it is your dwelling place. Let's act like and live like it is something grand and get dressed up for it the best you can. I was reading in Linda Lichter's book, Simple Social Graces. You know, I've been reading some chapters in this to you, and if I were to have a school, a homeschool for young ladies, or even those who are of us who are vital, and you know what that means, don't you? If all your vitals are working, no matter what your age, we don't say elderly around here. We say vital, because if your pulse is going and you're breathing and your heart is beating and everything is working, then you are vital. You're still vital. And therefore, God has a use for you, and He has a future and a hope for you as well. And so I've been reading in this book and found a place where she was talking about the appearance of the Victorian woman. And this book is called Simple Social Graces, and it would be a textbook if I had a school. And it was written to feminists. She started out as a feminist when she was writing it, and she was assigned by a newspaper apparently to find articles and write a series of things about how far we've come as women from the Victorian era, the restrained and restricted and repressive Victorian era. And so she learned a lot just by their photographs, their diaries, their art, their music, their furniture, the other things that they left behind, their letters, and their real personal history, family history, their family trees, their toys, their furnishings, their architecture. And she just went through all of this and wrote about the women of the times. And I ran across a part in here where she talked about their hair and the little combs that loved ones would buy them as a gift for their hair, to take care of their hair. And I learned from this book and from other books on the era that hair put up, every strand in place, was so important to them. The idea of free-flowing hair, that was for children, that was for little girls. And so the little girls knew it was quite grown up to put your hair up, and they had dress up trunks, you know, where they could dress up in old clothes that were long and pretend they were great ladies, and they would put their hair up, and they were not allowed to put their hair up until they got to be a certain age. Otherwise, it was free-flowing. It was considered a girl's style to not put your hair up. But once the hair was put up, and according to some of the things I've read about the Regency era and the writings of Jane Austen and other hints that we get from these books and novels, every strand had to be in place because it indicated what kind of person you were. So if your hair was down and you were grown up enough to have your hair up, and little girls used to beg their mothers, when can I put my hair up? That it indicated you were a mature lady, and that you were careful about your appearance. But hair, remember in Pride and Prejudice, the sister of Mr. Bingley said her hair, Louisa, and her petticoats, and just how disheveled she looked. And you were judged. It was based on what other people thought, and you tried not to offend, but your hair was in place. There was not the loose strands were at least curled and looked like they were deliberately put in place. And so I learned a little bit about that and tried to put my hair up today. And then I remembered somebody saying to me one time when I was wearing a dress, and I was on a little holiday, and it was someone we knew, and she said, "You should let your hair down, Lydia." And what she meant was, you should put on shorts and a tank top like the rest of us. Why don't you let your hair down? And so that became an expression decades ago. Let your hair down. It just meant get rid of your proprieties and your inhibitions and your sense of doing what is right. And so I came to dislike that word, let your hair down, because some people just enjoy being proper and restrained. Leave them alone. And but the whole idea of modern society, which she showed in this book, Simple Social Graces, was the people in the early 1900s, at least the controllers and those who were managing society, their aim was to make people let their hair down, get rid of their inhibitions, and let go of the restraints of the Victorian era. And she shows what folly it was, and how the 20th century ladies were the ones who lost a good deal of respect, and especially from men, because of that. And so I will try to read something from that book today, but so I wanted to start out by your appearance, and that's why I brought the hair up. I have frizzy hair and uncontrollable hair most of the time, but that is part of, the first thing you do is get dressed and get your hair done like you were going to do something important, or like someone was coming over, or you were going to do something. What would it take to make you more motivated for your home life? And of course, making a list is extremely important, because that shows you that the most important things that you need to do, and everybody's in a different stage of life. If you have small children, their needs always come first. You have to not take on extra activities while they're little. I've always warned women about that, didn't obey it myself all the time, but look back and have regrets about having taken on too much. So don't do extra church work, don't try extra things, just save your strength. Because what happens to women at home, and you need to know this, is they'll say in the morning, "Oh, I'm feeling pretty good. I've got this on my list and this, and I think I'll just go, and until I'm tired." And here's the problem. You do all these things, and then you just crash. You're just so tired at the end of the day. But really what should be done is the way they used to do it in the olden days was they'd have a list, but then after a certain amount of activity and things that had to do with homemaking, they would sit down and relax a little bit and revive. And instead of waiting until you're so tired that you're almost sick and you're exhausted, why not take a couple breaks a day where you deliberately rest, a deliberate rest? And it's hard for some of us because we are motivated, we want to do a lot of things, and it's very hard to take those deliberate rests. Well, that's what the little stack of reading material was for by the side of Mother's chair, was to sit and they would catch up on their reading. Have you ever heard of that? Well, some of you who are vital would remember that. I've got to catch up on my reading. And they would have saved things to read, maybe things that came in the mail, letters, or their Bible or books that they were enjoying. Certain magazines. Remember, we had the Ideals magazine. Everyone loved that. I think the Victoria magazine comes the closest to Ideals, although it's not done on the best of paper. But they, instead of waiting until you're all strung out and you're tired and you're just so depleted of strength and energy that you can't really function for your family, take some deliberate rest during the day. And there's a scripture that says, it's in Psalms, and of course I've lost my note that had that on there, and it said in quiet, it was quiet, and I believe contentment and quiet shall be your strength. Have you ever noticed when you take a few moments just to be quiet, just to sit still and be quiet, how your strength comes back? Your strength. You might think, I'm not going to be able to move anymore today. Take a little rest, and within a few minutes, you're up and around. And there's also nothing wrong with just sitting in your house. Now, I can understand that it's a bit anxiety-provoking to sit in your house when it's all crashing around you. But just to revive yourself a little bit and pay attention to the members of the family is very helpful. And so instead of running out of energy, deliberately take rest, because that's energy building. And there's nothing wrong with walking through your house. I love when I can't seem to get my mind to settle down and focus, I like to walk through and see what improvements need to be made. And they might not be things I can do, but I like to think about them. It cheers me up. And it also energizes me. So deliberate rest is very important in managing the home. That's part of your self-care. That's part of your tools. And you are a caregiver. So if you ever want to explore the idea of self-care, there are a lot of people online that are talking about it and writing about it and making suggestions about it, because there's a recognition now that women at home are caregivers. Now, one reason that we decide to be home is that we hope to have a good outcome. We hope to get some results from it. No one goes to work for, I would say, 40 years in a place and expects to come away with nothing. And so we women at home, we have to try to have an idea in our minds of what we want to accomplish so that we don't come away with nothing. And that's why it's so important to read Titus 2, where it talks about guiding and guarding the home, because we want to come away with something of value, and we want to guide our children and protect our families from a world that wants to pull them away. And today, if you have had that happen to you or to your children, it's very important, like in the name of self-care, to take regular bouts of just rest from thinking about it, rest from wrestling with it, and just revive yourself, because it can be very, very taxing. And we do want to have a good outcome, and God knows what we want, and He will help, and we've got to dedicate ourselves to it. And I am very sure that God does not look favorably on people that lure parts of your family away, or convince the world, convinces the family to leave their values, leave their roots. And I am sure that God will honor those who at least want to have a good outcome. I noticed in my homemaking part, I got to thinking about food preparation and how valuable it is to have one of those slow cookers. I know they're making them really elaborate now, where they are casserole dish size, and they're more shallow, and the plate comes out, and I was thinking about how interesting that is to have something that's being prepared without you standing over it. although there is an advantage to preparing your own food because it's a process. And I was talking to a young man who was talking about his grandmother who he remembered, and he said when they went to her house, she presided over her kitchen and prepared special food for all of the grandchildren, and he said it was such a treasure you couldn't even put a price on it. And it's hard for people to imagine that, but in a world where people go where food is already prepared and they don't get to see the process, this must have been very special for this young man. And one of the things that took women out of that desire to prepare food was the constant lure of these magazines and just a constant reminder, because I remember we had, I forget what they were called, but they were for women, and they would have titles on them like how to live on $10 a week food for your food budget. And it was all, the emphasis was on cheapness. It was all on being frugal with food. And what I would suggest, just from my own experience, is there's no point in doing that if no one likes the food that you're making. If you're following all these, it made people think, it made women think that they were supposed to be really cheap with food, really cheap on groceries, not spend any money on it, that because they were staying home and they weren't earning a big salary to, quote, pay their own way, that they had to be cut corners on the food. But what I would suggest you do, first of all, you have to observe that sometimes that is not a good idea. It's not highly nutritious, and it is sometimes the family doesn't like it, so there's a lot of waste. And I would say cut corners on other things. Cut corners on clothes. Cut corners on other things. And I'll tell you something, if you're staying home, you won't wear out your shoes so fast. Unless you live out on a farm or a manse like I do. I have boots, but you don't wear out your shoes quite so fast if you're not walking on hard concrete or you're not out all the time. But cut corners on other things, but never food. Always buy the best, the top of the line. Some people, they pay attention to all these loud headlines, how to live on a budget, a food budget, and so much a week, and they start to feel kind of panicky or guilty because that's their highest expense. I would say don't do that, and instead cut corners on other things and buy the best, because there's no point in buying something that's cheap or does not taste good or does not work well with your food preparation if it's going to be wasted. If they don't like it, if your family doesn't like it, they're not going to eat it, so you haven't really saved anything. And then people want to go out to eat because they're going to get hot food, they're going to get kind of high-end meals, and it's better just to go ahead and spend what you like. You can be frugal in many other ways in the home, but I don't believe you should ever be frugal with food, because that's your health, part of your health, and part of making your body and mind work for serving the rest of your family in their lives and helping them on their destiny in life. And so if that makes any sense, I hope you will take it to heart. But like I say, do things your own way. Many people don't have a lot of money to spend on big amounts of bulk food, And so there's no point, as I said in previous video, there's no point in buying 20 pounds of carrots if you haven't got any money left to buy something to go with them for a meal. So if you only have a small amount of money, you're going to have to figure out, and this is the fun of having homeschooled kids, you can take them to the grocery store and say, look kids, we've only got this much, we've got to have 2 meals out of it. So you help me find, what we could buy that would work with it. And just be careful not to be thinking too much about discount food if it's not good for you, and you could maybe cut corners in other areas. So beware of all those magazines with the announcements on them, how to get by on so much a week with food. And why they attacked the food, I don't know, but why didn't they attack the clothes? How to get by without buying clothes for a year. How to turn, we used to turn the collars around, remember? We'd turn them around and sew them back on so that the men could wear them out again on the other side. Wasn't that a lot of trouble? And we used to darn our socks, and that meant that we would sew the holes shut in the socks and they'd wear them. And that was back in the day when sometimes people didn't really buy socks. They were hand knit or handmade, so we learned how to repair them. And but why don't they ever have these headlines? It's always about the food, isn't it? The headlines on these magazines to say, dress well on, $10 a year. They never have that. And so I want to talk about a few other things. Today, and so I'm going to start with Tea with Jane Austen because it's pleasant. And while you work around your house, I want you to have something pleasant to listen to. I listen sometimes to audiobooks, which I really enjoy. However, if I get into a story that is going in a direction that I don't want, I quit the audiobook. I don't wait for the ending because if it's going to give me any kind of anxiety, I just don't want to know. And I'd rather write my own stories. My children and I write stories for each other that make people do what they should instead of disappointing us, and make things happen the way they should. And we really enjoy it. It makes us so happy. And we invent characters that just want to change the world. And so by just saying so, things happen. And so today I'm going to read to you out of Kim Wilson's Tea with Jane Austen. At first I didn't like this book. I almost put it on my free table because there weren't any recipes in it, and there's nothing in it that there just weren't the things in it that I was hoping. But then as I began to read it, and especially as I began to read it aloud, I realized it's a history book, and there are some things in it that are pretty valuable. So I've read a little of this before, and you might recognize it, but when I came back, because I'm so vital, I couldn't remember reading this paragraph, and yet I probably did. So I'm going to start it's about the different kinds of teas. They'd have evening teas and morning teas, and just think of that. And I lived in an era before it all kind of faded away, and then it was revived again in the 1980s, so that you can find tea rooms all over the world, all over America. You can go on YouTube and find how to do a tea, watch a tea being prepared or taken, and it's very exciting. And you can watch a lot of Jane Austen things or listen to Jane Austen reviews of Jane Austen stories, Jane Austen movies, and also there's a whole genre of people who write about the Regency era in Jane Austen's style. That's a lot of fun too. I haven't quite managed it myself, but they do it with such good knowledge. So this is called Tea in the Evening, from Tea with Jane Austen by Kim Wilson. The Austen family often visited or were visited by friends for tea and cards. The Austens, who were far from rich, seemed to have fulfilled a good many of their social obligations and invitations to tea. Now you remember in the book by Brian Kozlowski, they didn't, he had a part about socialization and health, and how they knew when they needed to be socialized and when they didn't, they needed to be quiet, that you didn't introduce anybody unless, or you didn't visit anybody unless they visited you, and vice versa. And when they visited you, that meant it was a coup for you to go and visit them. And it was very important to them. The Austins, who were far from rich, seem to have fulfilled a good many of their social obligations with invitations to tea. So a social obligation meant if someone had invited you over and you had accepted, then you would have this social obligation to also invite them. And if someone did invite you, you usually accepted it. Tea parties offered a less expensive way of entertaining friends than having them to dinner. I have found that too, and that's why in our ladies' Bible class I offer tea. It's just an easy way. The only thing that has to be hot is the tea. Everything else, you can serve dried foods, cold foods, anything, and it's not trying to get everything on the table at the same time while it's hot, and it's just not as stressful. I really enjoy it because anything goes good with hot tea. Even things that seem to be extremely plain, just as long as you have hot tea with it. I remember once a lady came over and we were painting the house and putting in a floor and doing quite a number of things, and she came over and I did want her to have a cup of tea, so I was able to muster that up, and I found some cheese and crackers, and she said that was one of the most delicious teas she had ever had, because as long as you've got a good quality tea, a good flavor, and it doesn't matter what kind of food because the tea is the big deal. And so it says here, tea parties offered a less expensive way of entertaining friends than having them to dinner. I totally agree with that. Dinner parties at that time could mean 2 full courses, each consisting of many expensive dishes. In contrast, refreshments served with tea were generally light: bread, toast, muffins, and perhaps cake. Of course, we always have other types of things to go with it that aren't just, flour products. She said, we ate 3 of the buns during the trip. That was when she was writing to Cassandra after arriving at her brother's house. The remaining 3 made an elegant entertainment for Mr. and Mrs. Tilson, who drank tea with us. An evening of tea, conversation, cards, and quiet bun nibbling, while not terribly exciting, could be a calm, pleasant way to pass the time. That reminds me, too, that our world is so fraught with anxiety that people wake up with it, don't know where it came from, and have a hard time with it, that these quiet tea times would be really worth preparing. It doesn't take a lot of preparation. It shouldn't put too much stress on you to do it. You don't even have to make a pot of tea. You could just use a tea bag and hot water. Just make sure it's hot, very hot. And the tea time magazines often have in the front of them, the beginning, the front page of the current issue, as to what temperature certain teas and tisanes require in order to make them taste good, make it workable. And so that's a good guide. So it could be a calm, pleasant way to pass the time. Jane Austen liked quiet tea drinkings. Now remember, I told you that she wrote her books to entertain her family. And that's what I think you should do. Just write little stories and everybody come together and you entertain your family with the evening story. I started telling one of my friends a story one day on text, and I thought, I think I'll just read it to her, because then I can make the stern man speak in a harsher voice, and I can make the some of the ladies speak differently and just kind of dramatize it. So I started she started calling me every night and saying, I'm ready for my story. So I would just make up a new chapter to read to her. And now she's texting me and saying, do I get another chapter tonight? So I'm having to add more chapters to this story so she can hear this story. And she's so tickled because she's in the story. I made up a character for her. And she said she's never been in a story before. So she's so excited because I've kind of analyzed her personality and made her do things and say things in the story that sound just like her. And I even make up sayings, because she makes up sayings. So I just make up sayings, new sayings for her. And so this is why Jane, this is what they would do in the evening, is read these stories. It says here, Jane Austen liked such quiet tea drinkings with friends and family, but she wasn't thrilled when a social duty forced her to mingle with people she found tedious rather than congenial. Don't we all? Haven't we all been in situations where we really felt like we should have stayed home, or rather been home, or maybe not included certain ones that put a damper on everything, or I was reading in Linda Lichter's book where there was a kind of an instruction. She had taken a little instruction from an old etiquette book of theirs from the 1800s, talking about people that gave sharp contradictions on how they were just not socially acceptable, and loud arguing. It just wasn't socially acceptable. And so they didn't get invited back. And look how much last few decades people have put up with in the name of, understanding and kindness, the things we have put up with. And if you have a family that's young and growing, I would not suggest you do that. If you've got somebody that you're just trying to be kind to, don't sacrifice your children on the altar of hospitality or ministry or anything like that. Don't put up with this, because it's not good for them. It's traumatizing for them, and it's not a good example either, and not good company. So if I had to do it again, there's some that I would not, some things that I would not do. A message came this afternoon from Mrs. Latouche and Miss East, offering themselves to drink tea with us tomorrow, she wrote to Cassandra. I am heartily sorry they are coming. It will be an evening spoilt to Fanny and me. On the other hand, such dutiful entertaining did force Jane to socialize with people who no doubt inspired many of the ridiculous or unpleasant characters in her books. Outwardly polite and pleasant, she stored up her impressions of such people and passed them on to Cassandra. Miss Millie's was queer as usual and provided us with plenty to laugh at. She talked on about it for half an hour, using such odd expressions and so foolishly minute that I could hardly keep my countenance. Oh, we all know one of those, don't we? T could also... One of the beauties of watching the 1990s Jane Austen film productions was that my children got to see how... And they were homeschooled, and so they got to see how ridiculous some people sounded who were just prattling on, and they didn't want to be like that. And they didn't want to be labeled as the talking aunt or anything like that. And so they got to see how that looked. And that is one of the beauties of drama and acting, is you get to... We put on plays at our house, and we make up the stories ourselves, make up the characters, and so we get to play ridiculous characters, and we get to make them do what's right. And it's so fulfilling for us, more than going out to a play. Tea could also form a separate social event following a dinner party. In Emma, the Coles host such a party, and it is understood that their dinner guests will stay for tea and the rest of the evening's entertainments. Other guests, however, are invited to arrive only after the meal is over to take tea and to spend the rest of the evening. Emma, the leader of society in Highbury, is naturally one of the dozen or so guests invited for the dinner itself. The male part of Mr. Cox's family are also among the chosen, but the less worthy females were to come in the evenings with Miss Bates, Miss Fairfax, and Miss Smith. Perhaps the Coles dining table could accommodate only so many, but the phrasing clearly conveys Jane Austen's opinion that being relegated to the after-dinner portion of the evening was a bit insulting. Insulting or not, it was very common practice at the time, and Jane's slightly bitter tone may have come from her own experiences. So, the next time I will read her chapter on an elegant entertainment. But one of the things that I like about the tea ceremony is you can get out some very nice cups and serviceware And no matter what your station in life, no matter what your income, uh, and no matter what your your possessions or your accumulation or your whether or not you live in a nice neighborhood, what they call a nice neighborhood, or one that's a little worn down, you have this elegant tea ceremony that just totally ignores all that status. It could be, it's like the man who wrote Revisiting America, the Frenchman, and he said Americans in the 1800s lived like kings in their log cabins, and he talked about how they, would take tea, or how they, the mother would have this very intricate embroidery that was usually identified as something a queen would have. And so that's the thing with tea, is it transports you no matter what your status is. There you go. You are, it brings you up. It's very refined. So now I'm going to read from Linda Lichter's book about the linens, and I'll show you one of Grandma's linens, and I went through her stuff so I could do this. And if you'll look at this on this blue background I have, that's a pansy. It's a giant pansy. And this was a set, and there were two of these opposite sides, and you put them on the arm of the chair so the chair would not wear out, or I have a worn out chair, so I lay them on that. And then there was another one that was longer, same pattern, and you'd put it on the headrest of the chair so that you wouldn't soil the chair. And the other day, after I read her article, I got into the box of these that I'd saved from Mr. S.'s mother, and I just took them out and I started laying them around. And I'm telling you, just that little movement, that little action of laying these soft things about and looking at them. Her sisters made a lot of them for her over the years, for birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas, New Year's, things like that. And she valued them. And when you went to her little house, it was smaller than the man's. This stuff was carefully laid all over, because she was from way back, and she was born before the Depression, I think. And her family had these things. In fact, they had those crocheted and needlework pillowcases. And on Sundays, they would just lay those out on the pillows and tell everybody, this is what our mother gave us for our wedding. And they would only come out, on Sunday. And they always had someone over on Sunday. And it was very, very, very important to them. So after I read that article to myself, I went and got all this stuff. And I just started laying them around the house. Well, what's wrong with it? Because they're better off probably on something than in a box where, after a while they don't smell so fresh. And so I have done some of that. And one thing you can do to protect them is put them under, if you want to use them on a table or use them somewhere, you buy this really nice shiny clear plastic by the yard. Somebody will cut it for you, and I always put it over, like if someone's going to have tea, I don't want to have to wash it. So as long as you buy the see-through plastic, not the foggy stuff, but I buy the high quality. I have a piece of it right here. I don't know if I can get it out and show you, but it has a shiny, you can see through it. If I put it over something, there wouldn't be any difference in what you saw. So I wanted you to know that. And I'm going to read Linda Lichter's story about these linens here. Very interesting. And I hope you're getting something done, because I don't really have anything to show you today. And so, homemade versus store-bought. I did start to read this last time, but I'll complete it today. I should maybe back up and show how the Victorian domestic soul was destroyed through people who were saying saving time became the bottom line for the home as well as business. Every appliance that replaced or made human labor faster became a must. Tradition fell before acquisition. Treasured family keepsakes that embodied continuity and cushioned household against crudities and pressure tactics of the commercial world became hand-me-downs, hated hand-me-downs destined for the scrap heap. And this is how she describes it. Perhaps most tragically, women were told that they had better things to do than engage in the formerly time-honored domestic arts. Now, I lived in an era where women had a basket or a satchel or a bag or something that had these something they were working on that was handwork, needlework, it could have been any kind of art type of work, or it could have been mending something, or it could have been sewing little squares together to make a patchwork of some kind, or it could have been crochet, it could have been knitting, it could have been needlepoint, it could have been just this kind of stuff. And they took it with them where they go, because there was a saying that I haven't heard it in a long time. They believed that idle hands were the devil's workshop, so they always wanted to have something to do with their hands, and they taught their children that too. And when we have children, there's no sibling picking on each other in rivalry if their hands are busy doing something useful. Their hands shouldn't be busy aggravating other people, and so they should be having something to do. If you've got time to use your hands in a aggravating way, then you've got time to do something beautiful and useful that you can see the outcome of. So they had these containers that they just kind of took with them, and I remember the last time I ever had anything like that, somebody in the 1960s saying something disparaging about it. Oh, that's a waste. It's just like this quote in this book. Oh, that's a waste of time. You don't have to do that anymore. People aren't doing that anymore, and it's not necessary. And so I'll read what she said about it, because it's just the same stuff. There's nothing new under the sun. Some of you might remember having handiwork. Well, the other night, somebody invited a friend of mine over to her house, and she said, Lydia, it was the nicest thing, because she said, if you've got anything you want to do, some needlework or something, bring it over, and you can work on it while we talk. And I thought that was really nice. Perhaps most tragically, women were told that they had better things to do than engage in the formerly time-honored domestic arts. They deemed it unforgivably passé to prepare meals from scratch instead of opening cans, or to dress your family and your rooms with the unique items you crafted rather than the cookie-cutter goods you purchased. The intricate needlework that gave such distinctive charm to the Victorian home was no source of pride or a sign of family devotion, just a pretty medieval accomplishment. See, they stopped understanding it. They stopped understanding the point of it. And it just looked like a material good after a while. So here's what happened. You start to see things a little differently when you read this, because she researched it. And petty is what the home was destined to become. They called it a petty medieval accomplishment. So you know what the word petty means. It means unimportant, small, just a bit of useless fluff. This lesson that the home is unimportant is not an easy one to unlearn, as I was to discover. Now remember, the writer was coming out of her accomplished life and learning about this Victorian era, and she said, it was this lesson that the home is unimportant is not an easy one to unlearn. How many of us, when the 60s and 70s hit, noticed that people got up in the day to go somewhere else, that no one stayed home. And people treated pets better than they did their own families because they let them stay home. And it was considered weak, and you were mooching off of people, and you were lazy if you were home. And that rumor is finally, I think, has been put to some rest since some of our world was shut down and people had to do their work at home and discovered that they could stay home. Upon completing college in the late 1970s, I was gravely disappointed when my graduation gift from an aunt turned out to be not the check I expected, but a set of bed linens my great-grandmother had embroidered in the 1880s for her trousseau. This seemed not only a useless relic, but an insult to a newly minted careerist. I shook my head in self-pity and disgust as I imagined all the hours my ancestress wasted stitching those fussy monograms, flowers, and scrolls for some anticipated home her Prince Charming would provide and rule. If I had to keep a memento of a woman I never met, why did it have to be this utterly impractical testament to her domestic bondage? I would have preferred her faded but proud college degree. Alas, she had none. And I have to stop and discuss a few points here because she talked about the monograms, flowers, and scrolls. Most homes had everything monogrammed and had your initial on it, including the silverware. You'd get silverware with your initial in it. And so people weren't anxious to part with it. And it was just something that they didn't want to do, and those weren't things you could go to the store and buy. They were all made for you, or if there was a new family, a new marriage, all this stuff would be for them with their initials on them. And she says she thought she would get a graduation gift would be a check. Well, I remember a story similar to this that Mr. S. often includes in sermons, and you probably heard it too, about the young man asked his grandfather asked him what he wanted for his graduation, or he asked his grandfather for a car. He said, "I want the money for a car for my graduation." And instead, upon his graduation, his grandfather had given him a new Bible. And the young man was very disappointed. His faith was not fully matured, and he just put the Bible up somewhere, and there was a card in it or something, but he didn't look at that Bible for years and years and years, and he was grossly disappointed. He had to go to work in order to get his car, and so years later, when his life wasn't panning out the way he wanted, and he turned to God, he got that Bible out, and he decided to read it from cover to cover, and came upon the page in which his grandfather had inserted an envelope with enough money to buy the car he wanted. And so that was just an illustration to use kind of like a figure of speech to show what treasure you might find in God's Word or in doing the right thing. So it's just to show that sometimes we pass up opportunities because they don't look what we think they should look like. And it's similar to what she said about these linens with the monograms, flowers, and scrolls for her anticipated home. So let's continue. After burying the linens in my parents' closet, I went off to graduate school with plain, wrinkle-free sheets to pursue a vision of womanhood unfettered by frou-frou items I couldn't bank or list on a resume. I forgot those linens for several years, and by the time I was obliged to reclaim them, my irritation had mellowed to indifference. Yet I toted them from house to house, ignoring them except to unpack and repack them after debating their fate with the Goodwill box. It was only gradually that I came to realize the value of those linens, beyond the escalating prices they command in antique shops. Like Mark Twain's father, who seemed to grow so wise between his son's 14th and 21st birthdays, the linens seemed to change over the years as I began to understand why the glue-binding Victorian homes and families had cracked and crumbled. Like other girls of her day, my great-grandmother learned such a reverence for home that she began to craft the things that would warm it with her personal touch before she had even had a home of her own. Well, you see this in one of the scenes of Pride and Prejudice, where as soon as Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy come to visit, all those girls got out their their needlework and started working on it, it gave them something to look at. Sometimes you get kind of awkward around company, or especially with people you're not familiar with, and it would be nice to have something to do with your hands. And of course now, they have the phone, but they had something to show for what they were doing with their hands. And later on, I think it was Mr. Bingley that said those girls do so much, and they sew, and they do tapestries, and they do artwork, and showing that how honorable that was. So she says that her grandmother began to craft these things before she even had her own home. And everybody knew that that's what it was for. It was for their home. In fact, bachelors in my day, back in the in the wilderness, they wanted to bring a wife home. They wanted to be married because they'd get some curtains in the windows, and they'd get a tablecloth on the table, and it would just be like a real home to them. That mattered to them. She knew her efforts would be honored, not disdained, by her family to be. These days you can't be sure of that. You put all these little fro-fro things or frou-frou things around, and someone's going to make a rude remark because they've been taught from just culture to look down on it. Isn't that sad? But what I'd do is I'd pick it up and, oh, you think this is silly or funny? I'll have you know, so-and-so made this, and it was during a trying time of her life, and she was going through the depression and all that, and just read a story into it. These are very important, and it's very important to train our girls to do these things with their hands, because we're going to be entering an era where you can't depend on your wedding shower to get all the things that you need. And you might want to have these things. And I can remember people washing these and starching them and laying them flat and, giving them a new look again. Like other girls of her day, my great-grandmother learned such a reverence for home that she began to craft the things that would warm it with her personal touch, even before she had her own home. She knew her efforts would be honored, not disdained by her family to be, because such efforts were almost universally practiced. Yes, it does help if everyone else is doing it. It's very hard to live in a wilderness type of culture that what you want to do, no one else wants to do and is not doing it. And that really takes conviction. It really takes good, what I would say, bravery. Far from being quaint creations of small-town provincials, needlework provided inspiration to the most noted artists of her time. Now, if you'll go and look for the paintings of the 1800s, 17, 18, 1600s, and early 1900s, you'll find many, many artists had painted a woman sewing, or a woman doing tapestry, or a woman doing needlework. That was the subject of many artists. It was probably a common sight, but it was very beautiful and inspiring, especially, the women tried to look nice too. They tried to fix their hair and put every little strand away, and it presented a very calming and pretty sight. With all the wars going on and all the upheaval and turmoil in the world, this is one thing that it would inspire an artist. And how much does our life as women at home inspire an artist? I like to do little sketches of my descendants or children when I see them do something, because it inspires me. They're not the best, but it's just something I like to do. So he says the Impressionist wife inspired him to paint, and she has a picture here below that's just black and white, and it's a grandmother teaching a little girl how to sew, and it was called Penelope and Young Women Sewing. Mary Cassatt did a portrait of the same title, as well as Lydia at the tapestry loom. Women also stitched domestic sentiments into samplers. Now, a sampler was when you used every number or letter of the alphabet and you just put a fancy stitch in it. And Women also stitched domestic sentiments into samplers, now costing thousands of dollars, that were prominently displayed with words like, "Peace to this house," "God bless our home," "Home sweet home." And I remember another message was, "Peace to all who enter here." Those were very important messages, and they were done with the needle and the thread. I finally appreciate the meaning of their art, which lies beyond mere artistry. Along with the art in the linens I once found useless and now feel unworthy to use. Even without a string of degrees and a key to the executive washroom, my great-grandmother created both a place and a sense of home most of all us will never know. By current standards, she may have been an imprisoned victim of sex discrimination, but her descendants are the real losers. I sometimes wonder whether she made Edith Wharton's prescribed 12 of everything for her trousseau, and I envy the skills I lack. I owe a much belated apology to the woman I was never privileged to meet, except through her legacy, but it's not too late to atone. This is why this is so important to teach the next generation, or learn it yourself. One thing that you have to do is not be in despair because the next generation is not following some of these home arts. Do it yourself. Anything you want that generation or other people to do, just do it yourself, and it's very fulfilling. And there's just so much more to this than just a pretty little piece of something. And I still can remember this set on her chairs. And there's a butterfly. Oh, you have to kind of hold it up against something dark. It was made to go on wood, dark wood, to protect the furniture. There's a butterfly there that was done. Let me see if I can cram some more into this broadcast for you so you can get more done. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about people and about your standards for your home and for your family. Now, one thing that really helps is if you teach your children to recite these standards to someone who's wanting them to do something, wanting them to go somewhere, wanting them to participate in something, is you tell them what the standard is. The standard is we don't go anywhere without our parents, or the standard is my mom and dad have to be consulted first. That's a bad thing, because if you have to tell someone, well, I have to ask my mom and dad, then they're going to wait for an answer, and it's just awkward. It's really better to instill in your children your standards so that the children carry the standards to the people that are reaching out for them to want to participate in something, do something, eat something, and just say, well, my family doesn't do that. Well, my family's not going to be participating, or just give them the answer right away. Otherwise, it's harder, and it just becomes more and more awkward. And we really have a problem with our standards because other people don't understand what they are, and so then there's a conflict. So the best thing to do is train your children to say, no, I'm not allowed to ride in a car with anyone unless it's my brother or my father. Train them to say it, and then they don't have to go to you and try to talk you out of your standard or create just more conflict. So train your children to carry on the standards and to teach the standards to other people. For example, someone wants your teenage children to go to a late night thing at their house, and it's Christian, so nobody's going to be drinking, and it's just all going to be nice. You say, my parents don't allow us out after 8 o'clock, and so we have to stay home at night and do something quiet. And so that's the thing to do, is tell your children, you have to be here, and we do something quiet after dinner. And not to accept these invitations, but to tell them, don't say, oh no, I can't. Just say, our family doesn't do that, or our family wants us to stay home in the evening. And then you have a policy that someone will remember. It's our family policy that we stay home in the evenings, that we're not out after dark. it's our family policy that we only eat at home, or it's our family policy that whatever it is that you're having a problem with, pass the policy down to the child and let the child answer right away. For example, I gave you an example not long ago where one of the granddaughters was kind of cornered by someone who wanted to give her something to mend. And this is the problem with when you get some skills and you start to mend and sew and everything, people want you to do things. And of course, they're offering to pay and everything. But the girl was very, very young. I think she was only 13. And her mother didn't want her laboring too much for other people. And so the girl didn't know what to say. So finally, the mother had to take her aside and say, when someone does that, say, my mother doesn't allow me to work for other people, or my mother doesn't allow me to mend things, something like that. And otherwise it's going to be very, very awkward as one person tries to talk a young person into something, because they're from a different culture, and they think that once you get to be a certain age, you make up your own mind about everything, so they can just go right up to you and ask you to take something, to do something, to whatever, and they don't understand that. So what the people need to learn to do is teach your children what to say right away, so that you don't stand there dickering and arguing and because you could say, could you mend this for me? And she could say, I don't really have time. Well, you would have time if I did this for you. And then pretty soon someone's trying to talk you into something. They're knocking down all your excuses. So it's best to have a family policy or values and standards that your kids translate to the other person, if they're able to. If not, you have to ask the mother. But then once the mother's been asked or the father's been asked, the father and mother should report back and tell the other person what the policy is or the standard is, rather than sending the child back to say, my mom says no. Because what's happening is they're trying to get people away from their family, from their parents' authority. And I talked to you before about outsourcing your authority, even with the child. Sometimes your child, they're growing up a little bit and you want them to make decisions, but you will find that people find ways around it because they don't understand family. They don't understand family policy. Let me see if I've got anything else I can talk to you about today. I have, someone sent me the most beautiful book, and it's blank pages. They're lined pages. And so I decided to start it out by writing down everything I could think of, like what was on my mind that day. And I particularly was interested in the subject of calmness, because we had snow. And so I decided for my ladies' class that one of the subjects we would have is what the Bible says about snow. So we looked up all the scriptures about snow and read them and showed how God used snow as a figure of speech and a comparison sometimes. But then we looked up the nutrients of snow, what snow provides, nitrogen and sulfur, and how it fertilizes the land, and also that it puts a blanket of insulation on the world and it takes out apparently 60% of the noise outside and even inside, you can tell, and how we need that cushion from the noise once in a while, how important that is. And so we have been talking about snow and how calming it is, especially with the noise. And so I began to make a list of things about calming in this book. And you remember I talked to you before about commonplace books, and you can find those on Wikipedia. And what they were books that people used to keep with sayings and scriptures and things they copied from other books, and they weren't things they just made up themselves. They were just commonplace books with information in them, and sometimes used for school. But this is my commonplace book. So I decided to do calmness because we had been talking about snow and the effect that it has on your nerves, that it's so calming, and we studied what the nutrients were and how important it was, and then we found the scriptures on them, and we started to understand the purpose and the value of snow. So finding answers to calmness. And so feet, my mother had sent me a book about the feet, and it had a little map of the foot on the underside of the foot on what possible nerves everything in the foot was connected to, which I thought was very interesting. But they suggested in there to make an oil mix for feet that had calming essential oils in them with a carrier oil. So I wrote down those ingredients. And also something that my family and I have always talked about is when stress comes, recall what you were doing or the routine you were following or what event it was where you didn't feel stress, where you felt the less stress. And that means that you had some reprieve from it and what we're doing, and not just to think of it for a feeling of less stress, but to actually reproduce it, to redo it. So in Isaiah 35 says, "In quietness and confidence shall be your strength." Isaiah 35. Try to achieve that. Just a few moments of quiet every now and then, and watch how your strength comes back for the things of the home that you must do. Another thing that I think is important for calmness is to extend the quietness, the nonverbal times in your day, so that each day you go a little longer without talking, and keep the talking down, keep the rest of your voice, until you can find that a great deal of the day can be spent without exerting your voice too much. You know, if you're raising children, the more you talk, the less they hear. So if you speak in fewer words, they're going to take note of them more excellently. They're going to remember them. So, have personal experience. Create personal experiments. I've said you're the scientist and you are the experiment. Personal experiments on achieving calmness. Ways to calm. And I started with prayer, bodily movements, walking through your house, just sitting down, or other things. Everybody's different. There are ways of breathing. There are scents of calmness. Do you remember, some of you who are vital, how people used to go to church with a little, the man had a little buttonhole in his collar, his lapel, and he'd put a flower in there, a fresh flower, probably picked from his yard or somewhere, and the woman had a little corsage on hers, and they always had a scent. And you'd go to church, and there was this calming scent of rose and lavender and other things that we've lost, and no one really wants to tell us about this. I say no one, but no one who's trying to control or make money. They don't want us to know about that because they want us to buy their stuff, or they want us to buy their pharmaceutical that's going to give us that calmness, but also has side effects. Now, I realize a lot of people sneeze and are allergic to fresh flowers, but there are other scents that can help calmness. You could do a search for that. Scents that encourage calmness or produce calmness. Tastes or foods or teas that produce calmness. You can do a complete search on it. Activities. Scents of the past used by our ancestors. Teas that calm. Songs. Psalms. Organizing and orderliness. Sometimes I'll look at something that needs to be organized and it just seizes me up with stress just looking at it. But if I'll take one little thing at a time, and the more organized I get, the more at ease I feel. And the very things that would help us, sometimes we don't do because the thought of it and looking at the whole thing is stressful. Looking at beauty, I told you about how we used to have scrapbooks, and people would just sit and go through their scrapbooks, maybe adding things and enjoying them. They were the ideal magazine because it didn't have anything you didn't want. You just tore out the pages you wanted and put them in your scrapbook. Healthful living, quiet, creativity is also very calming if you don't make it into a job, if you don't push it, if you just do it because you like it. And then slow living. There are a lot of channels on YouTube of women who have decided to participate in slow living. And some of them are just very quiet videos where you just watch them do things in a slow way. Instead of always being stress cleaning or hurrying with a meal because people are hungry, try slow food preparation. Try slow writing. Anybody want to improve their writing? Try writing very slowly and writing a little less. When you have to send a note or a letter. Slow sorting, slow folding. You get your laundry and you sort it out and just do it slowly and deliberately and feel everything and fold them and think about what you're doing. Slow sewing. That's why there was a channel on YouTube of a woman who, no, it wasn't. It was a blog someone had on the advantages of hand sewing. You don't get this factory backache feeling of leaning over the machine and this industrial work. You just take it wherever you want to go and you sit wherever you want. It's very adjustable. You don't get worn out or tired from it. There's no noise. Machines sometimes make a bit of a racket. And she had this beautiful blog about the importance and the advantages of hand sewing. You actually can get a lot done. And there was a poem written a century ago called The Long White Seam that was talking about a woman who was sewing her wedding dress. Slow decor. Those of you who like to decorate, taking something and setting it somewhere and standing back and looking at it and not being in trying to get things done attitude, but just the slow living. And making your home a private, personal resort is a lot better than getting all stressed out, wearing yourself out, and then having to go somewhere else for a vacation. And it's a lot cheaper too. It's very profitable. Making your home full of the things that give you comfort and rest and like a private personal resort, which is really better because you've got your own things about you. No one else has used your towels and no one has slept on your bed, and it's all yours and it's clean and it's not public and it's very, very private. You've got your own private resort at home. So ladies, I would like to stay with you longer, but I think you've had enough. And I keep saying I'm going to go to this book, School Can Wait Too. And maybe next time I'll get to it, which is pretty good. It just generally outlines. It's a very intricate book. It's not easy reading, and they use a lot of statistics and studies and things like that, peer-reviewed studies, and it talks about how much better off children are with the sameness of home and very little artificial stimulation, how much better off they are. Maybe we would be better off too. So ladies, until I see you next time, stay close to Christ. Thank you for all you do for me. Those of you who make contributions, they're very much appreciated. So if you would like to leave a comment, you may, or if you're having trouble leaving a comment on the format that it's at, you can always send me your comment on email. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.